The town of Willow Creek always looked different at sundown. The dust rising from wagon wheels seemed to glow under the slant of amber light, and the crooked wooden storefronts cast long shadows across the empty street. For Ethan Walker, a widower of 5 years and a rancher whose world had grown painfully small, the sight stirred little more than a hollow ache. Once, he had walked these roads with his wife's hand nestled in his own, listening to her laughter weave through the noise of merchants and cattlemen. Now, he passed through like a ghost among the living, only nodding at a saloon keeper or tipping his hat to a stable boy before retreating again to the silence of his ranch. That evening, after a day spent bargaining at the cattle yards, Ethan reined his horse toward the general store. He had meant only to fetch supplies, flour, beans, maybe a fresh pair of gloves for the spring work ahead. Yet fate, as it often does, had other plans waiting in the shadows. He noticed them first as stillness against the movement of town. A woman stood near the porch of the store, her figure framed by the fading light. Around her clustered 5 children, each with the restless unease of hunger and fatigue. Their clothes were threadbare, dust clung to their hems, and their eyes, sunken and wary, darted about as though searching for kindness in a place that had little to spare. The woman kept her shoulders straight despite exhaustion pressing on her frame. A bonnet shaded most of her face, but when she glanced toward the doorway, Ethan caught a glimpse of eyes clouded with both pride and desperation. She held a small child in her arms, no more than 2, while the older ones tugged at her skirt, whispering with voices too faint for him to catch. Ethan tied his horse loosely and lingered, watching. Townsfolk passed the family with sidelong glances, some shaking their heads, others muttering under breath. Another mouth to feed, one man grumbled as he stepped down the boardwalk. She should move on, a woman whispered to her companion. This town can't carry strays. The words stung Ethan, not for their cruelty, but for the strange stirrings they awoke in him. He had known loneliness, but not the kind that drove one to beg in the open street. His hand brushed the scarred leather of his gloves, a small habit when he wrestled with uneasy thoughts. He could have walked past. Indeed, part of him wanted to. Sympathy, he told himself, often demanded more than he was willing to give. Yet when the youngest boy, perhaps 6 or 7, lifted his face toward him, Ethan felt a jolt. The boy's eyes, wide and solemn, mirrored the same hollow look Ethan had seen in his own reflection years ago, after burying his wife. A look carved by loss. The woman gathered courage enough to approach the storekeeper, her voice firm though it trembled at the edges. "Please," she said, "is there work? I can wash, mend, anything. My children, they haven't eaten since morning." The storekeeper, an older man with thinning hair, shifted uncomfortably. "Times are lean," he muttered. "Best try your luck down the road." She thanked him quietly, though her words tasted of defeat, and stepped back to gather her children. The little ones' faces fell, their hope as fleeting as the last streak of daylight slipping beyond the rooftops. Something inside Ethan tightened. He turned his gaze away, intent on entering the store, but his boots felt heavy, as if chained by memory. He thought of his wife, Anna, who had once insisted they never turn away a soul in need. "Kindness costs less than regret," she had often said. He had tried to bury those words with her, but they rose now like ghosts refusing to rest. He lingered too long, for at that moment, the woman's knees buckled, exhaustion overtaking her. The child in her arms slipped dangerously, and the eldest son rushed forward to steady both mother and sibling. The boy's small hands shook as he tried to bear more weight than any child should. Without thinking, Ethan strode across the street. "Easy," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He caught the woman by the elbow, steadying her. Her skin felt cold through the thin fabric of her sleeve. She looked up, startled, meeting his gaze for the first time. Her eyes, gray with flecks of green, carried both suspicion and relief. "I'm fine," she whispered, though clearly she was not. "You need food," Ethan replied bluntly. His tone made the eldest child stiffen, as if bracing for rejection. "We'll manage," she said, pulling her arm gently away. Her pride was evident, but hunger louder still in the way the children swayed on their feet. Ethan studied her for a moment longer. "Name?" he asked. "Clara Hayes," she answered, voice low. Then, gesturing to her children, "Samuel, Ruth, Benjamin, Mary, and little Daniel." Ethan's eyes swept over them, each child fragile yet resilient. Samuel, the eldest, held himself protectively. Ruth, around 10, clutched her sister's hand with quiet determination. Benjamin fidgeted, restless as if to distract himself from hunger, while Mary, perhaps 4, gazed at Ethan with shy curiosity. Baby Daniel whimpered softly, nestling into his mother's shoulder. Ethan's jaw tightened. "My ranch is 5 miles west," he said finally. "I've room enough, food enough. You'll work for your keep, but you won't go hungry." Clara hesitated, her pride wrestling with desperation. She searched his face, perhaps weighing whether the stranger was another man to fear. But the sight of her children, hollow-cheeked and trembling, made the decision for her. She nodded once, slowly. "Thank you," she whispered, the words nearly breaking. Ethan turned away quickly, masking the storm within him. He told himself it was duty, not compassion. That he simply couldn't watch children starve while he had more than he needed. But deep down, he knew it was something more dangerous, the stirring of a heart he thought long buried. As the group prepared to follow him, the town's eyes burned into his back. Whispers rose again, louder this time. Walkers taking them in? Fools lost his senses. He ignored them. The sound of 5 pairs of small footsteps trailing behind him seemed louder than the entire town. Each step echoed not only on the wooden boards but deep within his chest. By the time they reached the edge of town, the last streaks of sunlight had given way to dusk. Ethan mounted his horse, glancing back at Clara and the children trudging wearily along. Something about their silhouettes against the fading horizon unsettled him. As they set out for the ranch, he felt the weight of an unspoken question pressing on him. Had he just saved them, or had he invited a storm into his already fragile world? The answer, he knew, would come soon enough. But for now, the sun had set, and their story had only begun. The Walker Ranch stood in quiet isolation, miles of open pasture rolling into the horizon, framed by mountains that turned purple at dusk. To Ethan, the land was both a burden and a refuge, work enough to numb grief, space enough to keep the world at bay. But as he rode home that night, Clara and her 5 children trailing behind him, the familiar silence of the plains seemed different. The rhythm of their footsteps and the faint murmur of children's voices pressed against the solitude he had carried for years. By the time they reached the ranch, the moon had risen. Ethan dismounted and led his horse into the barn. Clara stood nearby, holding Daniel while the older children clustered together, eyes wide at the sprawling farmhouse. It was sturdy but weathered, its paint faded, the porch creaking under the weight of years. "You'll sleep inside," Ethan said, his tone practical. "There's space in the guest room, though it'll be crowded." Clara nodded, gratitude softening the tension in her shoulders. Samuel stepped forward quickly, as if to shield his mother from further embarrassment. "We can sleep anywhere, sir. Floor's just fine." Ethan studied the boy. Samuel's chin lifted with pride, but his thin frame betrayed hunger. "No one sleeps on the floor," Ethan said curtly, then opened the door. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine and smoke. The parlor bore the marks of disuse, dust layered on shelves, curtains drawn tight. Clara's eyes flickered across the room, pausing at a framed photograph on the mantelpiece. A young woman smiled from the picture, her hand resting on Ethan's shoulder. Clara looked away quickly, understanding instinctively that the image explained more than words ever could. The children, restless with hunger, pulled her sleeve. Ethan noticed and wordlessly went to the kitchen. Soon, the smell of cornbread warming in the oven filled the space. He placed beans, bread, and milk on the table, more than enough for all. The children stared in awe. Ruth, the second eldest, whispered, "Mama, real milk." Clara urged them to wait, but Ethan gestured.
"Eat," he said.
They needed no second invitation. Samuel tried to pace himself, but hunger betrayed his restraint. Benjamin stuffed bread so fast he choked until Clara steadied him with a hand. Ethan watched silently, arms crossed. Something stirred in him, something he resisted acknowledging. Their gratitude wasn't loud or demanding. It was in the way Ruth carefully saved half her portion for little Mary, in how Samuel wiped crumbs from the table after the meal. Survival had taught them humility. When the children finally fell asleep, Daniel in his mother's arms, the others curled together like puppies in the spare room, Clara remained at the table. She looked exhausted, her eyes rimmed with shadows, but she held herself with quiet dignity. "You didn't have to do this," she said softly. Ethan sat across from her, staring at the wood grain on the table. "Children shouldn't go hungry," he replied. Clara's lips trembled into a small, weary smile. "That's kindness talking. Most men don't bother." He shrugged, unwilling to let her words settle. "It's not kindness, just necessity." But the truth gnawed at him. He had done it not from necessity, but from something deeper, something dangerously close to the compassion he'd sworn to bury. The next days unfolded in unfamiliar rhythm. Clara insisted on working from the first morning. She scrubbed floors until they shone, mended torn linens, and brought warmth into rooms long left untouched. The children, too, found ways to help. Samuel carried water, Ruth tended the small garden, Benjamin followed Ethan in the barn, eager but clumsy. At first, Ethan resisted their presence, retreating to the fields under the excuse of labor. Yet he found their absence more noticeable than their chatter. He began to look forward to Benjamin's endless questions. "Why does a horse need shoes? How many acres do you have? Did you always live alone?" Though he answered most with gruff brevity. One evening, Clara prepared supper using little more than potatoes and herbs she had gathered. The smell carried through the house, earthy and inviting. Ethan sat at the table, watching the children laugh softly as they ate. For the first time in years, his house echoed with voices. He realized, almost with alarm, that the silence he once craved now felt unbearable in comparison. But trust came slowly. Clara remained guarded, her gratitude tempered by caution. She never asked for more than what was offered, never allowed her children to appear ungrateful. Ethan respected her pride, though he noticed the lines of worry that deepened whenever she thought no one was looking. One night, as a storm rumbled across the plains, Clara lingered by the fire after the children slept. Ethan had been oiling his rifle, but her quiet presence drew his gaze. "Why Willow Creek?" he asked finally. Her hands stilled on the fabric she was mending. "Because it was the last place the map showed before the road ran out," she said simply. "I thought maybe here we'd find mercy." Ethan felt her words strike something raw in him. Mercy. It was not a word he had allowed himself since burying Anna. He cleared his throat. "You'll find work enough here," he said. "That's not mercy. It's labor." Clara met his eyes, her expression unreadable. Sometimes labor is mercy, too. The fire popped, and for a moment, the air thickened with unspoken truths. Ethan wanted to ask about the children's father, about the road that had brought her to the edge of desperation. But something held him back. He feared her answers might draw him too close, too entangled. The neighbors soon noticed. At the post office, whispers spread faster than dust in the wind. "Walker's taken in a woman and her brood," one man sneered. "Reckon he's lost his mind. Or maybe his loneliness got the better of him." Ethan heard the talk but ignored it. Yet he couldn't ignore the shift inside himself. He began setting aside extra rations without thinking, mending a fence with Samuel at his side instead of working alone, finding himself listening for Clara's voice when she hummed quietly over chores. Compassion, once banished, had returned. It grew in small, stubborn ways, like the green shoots pushing through dry soil after a long drought. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in gold, Ethan returned from the barn to find Clara sitting on the porch. Daniel lay asleep against her shoulder, while Mary nestled at her feet. The scene struck him with such force he froze. It was a portrait of life, fragile yet enduring, that he thought forever lost to him. Clara looked up, catching his gaze. Neither spoke. But in that silence stretched the fragile beginning of trust, a recognition that perhaps neither of them had to carry their burdens alone anymore. Ethan stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking under his weight. He wanted to say something, to fill the moment with words, but found none that were adequate. Instead, he sat down a few feet away, watching the horizon alongside her. The dusk settled slowly, and though nothing was spoken, the seeds of compassion had been sown, seeds that, though fragile, promised to grow. The plains were greening with the promise of summer, but Ethan Walker felt no ease in the changing season. For weeks, Clara and her children had woven themselves into the rhythms of his home. He found himself anticipating the sound of their laughter drifting through the open windows, the aroma of Clara's simple meals, the weight of little Daniel's hand tugging at his pant leg. And yet, beneath the surface of daily life, something gnawed at him, a persistent unease he could neither name nor shake. It began with Samuel. The boy worked beside him with steady determination, his frame thin but his spirit unyielding. One afternoon, while they repaired a broken fence, Samuel wiped his brow and asked, "Did you ever have sons, Mr. Walker?" The question landed like a blow. Ethan's grip on the hammer tightened until his knuckles turned white. "Once," he said shortly, forcing the words out. "But they're gone." Samuel tilted his head, curiosity flickering in his eyes, but he did not press further. Ethan was grateful for the silence, though the exchange haunted him. That night, he dreamed of his past, Anna's laughter, the soft cry of an infant, the fever that stole both mother and child before he could summon help. He awoke drenched in sweat, heart pounding, unable to shake the image of a tiny face that had vanished into the earth. Days later, the echoes of that grief sharpened when he noticed Daniel more closely. The toddler bore a startling resemblance to Anna, his dark curls, his solemn eyes, even the dimple that appeared when he smiled faintly. Ethan told himself it was coincidence, the tricks of memory coloring his perception. But the feeling only deepened as he watched Daniel toddle across the yard, laughter ringing out in tones that tugged at something buried deep. One evening, Ethan sat at the kitchen table sharpening a knife when Clara entered quietly. She hesitated, then placed a folded piece of cloth on the table. "I've been meaning to ask," she began carefully, "do you know anyone named Joseph Walker?" The name pierced him like lightning. Ethan froze, the knife slipping against the whetstone. "Why?" His voice was harsh, sharper than he intended. Clara flinched but steadied herself. "Because, before we came here, I was told Daniel's father's name was Joseph Walker." Ethan's pulse thundered. He stared at Clara, struggling to process her words. "What are you saying?" Clara lowered her gaze. "I wasn't always alone. Daniel isn't. He isn't like the others. My late husband took me in when I had nothing. But before him there was someone else. A drifter, a man who passed through the town where I worked. He never stayed, never gave more than his name. Joseph Walker." The room seemed to tilt. Ethan gripped the edge of the table, the truth slamming into him with brutal clarity. Joseph, his younger brother, the boy who had left home years ago chasing freedom and fortune, vanishing into the wilderness without a word. Ethan had mourned him as lost, just as he had mourned Anna and the infant they buried. And now Joseph's blood sat before him, laughing in the yard, calling Clara Mama. Daniel was not his lost son, but he was kin, flesh and blood. Ethan's chest ached with a mixture of rage and wonder. Rage at his brother's reckless choices, wonder at the fragile child who carried the Walker name without knowing it. He looked at Clara, whose eyes brimmed with unspoken fears. "You should have told me sooner," Ethan said, voice low. "I didn't know if I could trust you," she admitted. "You've been kind, but the world hasn't been. And I feared if you knew, you might cast us out." Ethan's jaw tightened. Part of him wanted to retreat, to build back the walls that compassion had begun to erode. But when he looked toward the small bed where Daniel now slept, curls damp with sweat, the urge faltered. He could not deny the truth, not of blood, not of responsibility. That night, Ethan walked the fields under the silver light of the moon, wrestling with the revelation. His brother's choices had left a child adrift, and fate had delivered that child into his care. The weight of it pressed upon him heavier than any burden the ranch demanded. He thought of Anna, of the child they lost, of the hollow years that followed. Perhaps Providence had not abandoned him after all. Perhaps this was mercy in disguise. But mercy came with risk. To accept Daniel, and by extension, Clara and her other children, was to open the door to attachment, to vulnerability. And Ethan knew too well the pain of losing those he loved. Could he bear it again? The following morning, Ethan found Samuel already in the barn, pitchfork in hand. The boy glanced up, his expression steady. "You were out late," he remarked. Ethan studied him, recognizing in Samuel the same guarded pride he once carried as a youth. "There are things I need to set right," Ethan said, almost to himself. Samuel frowned, but said nothing more. Still, his loyalty, the way he had stepped into the role of protector for his siblings, spoke volumes. Ethan realized with quiet awe that compassion was not only sprouting within him, but mirrored in these children. Later that day, Clara joined him by the corral, her face pale from sleeplessness. "I didn't mean for secrets to linger between us," she said softly. "But I need you to understand, I never wanted charity. Only a chance to keep my children alive." Ethan met her gaze, the hardness in his eyes giving way to something gentler. "This isn't charity. Daniel is my blood, which means all of you are tied to me now, whether we planned it or not." Tears glistened in Clara's eyes, though she held them back with strength. "And what do you want to do with that truth?" Ethan looked toward the horizon, where the sun burned crimson against the plains. He didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time in years, he felt something stir in him stronger than grief, an obligation born not of duty alone, but of love rediscovered in an unexpected form. The truth had been revealed, and with it, the fragile walls around Ethan's heart had begun to crumble. Yet revelation was not resolution. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with choices that would test the limits of his compassion. Still, as the evening shadows stretched across the land, Ethan knew one thing with unshakable clarity. He would not let Daniel, or Clara, walk the hard road alone. The dawn broke across the plains in a wash of pale gold, spilling over the fields and dusting the ranch with quiet beauty. Ethan Walker stood on the porch, shoulders squared against the chill, watching as the horizon stretched open before him. For years, he had begun his mornings alone, his heart walled in, his hands occupied with the endless labor of survival. Yet this morning was different. Behind him, the muffled sounds of children stirring drifted through the house, and Clara's soft voice coaxed them awake. The truth he had unearthed days ago still reverberated within him. Daniel was not merely Clara's child, but his own kin, his brother Joseph's son. That revelation had cracked something inside him wide open, forcing Ethan to reckon with the ghosts of family he had buried long ago. But revelation was only the beginning. Love, real love, demanded a choice. Clara joined him on the porch, a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. Her face bore the weariness of a woman who had known too much hardship, yet her eyes glowed with quiet resolve. For a moment they stood in silence, the air between them heavy with unspoken fears. "You've hardly spoken since I told you," Clara said finally. Her voice trembled, though she tried to keep it steady. Ethan exhaled slowly. "I've been trying to make sense of it all. My brother, your boy, this chance that fate has dropped in my lap." His jaw clenched as he turned to her. "I've lost too much, Clara. A wife. A child. I swore I'd never let myself feel that kind of pain again." Clara met his gaze, her eyes glistening in the pale light. "And yet here you are, letting yourself feel it all over again." The truth of her words cut deep. Ethan looked away, to where Daniel's laughter echoed faintly from inside the house. The sound was both balm and torment, sweet because it breathed life back into him, bitter because it threatened to open wounds he had never fully healed. Clara touched his arm gently. "Pain doesn't mean love isn't worth it. It means love mattered. And maybe, just maybe, it can matter again." Ethan's throat tightened. He wanted to believe her, but belief was dangerous. To open his heart was to risk losing everything once more. That day, he worked the fields with Samuel, their silence broken only by the scrape of shovels and the lowing of cattle. Ethan watched the boy, how he moved with steady resolve, how he looked after his siblings with the gravity of someone far older than his years. In Samuel, Ethan saw a reflection of his own younger self, proud, guarded, desperate to shield those he loved. "Samuel," Ethan said quietly as they stacked hay, "you've carried a heavy load for your family." Samuel shrugged, wiping sweat from his brow. "Somebody had to. Mama can't do it all. And Daniel's just a baby." "You've done well," Ethan said, the words rough but sincere. "Better than many grown men I've known." Samuel studied him for a long moment. "Are you going to send us away?" The question hit Ethan like a hammer. He dropped the pitchfork and turned to face the boy squarely. "No," he said firmly. "I don't know what the future holds, but I won't turn my back on you or your mother." For the first time, Samuel's guarded expression softened, a flicker of trust breaking through. That evening, after the children were asleep, Ethan sat with Clara by the hearth. The firelight painted her features in warm hues, casting shadows that seemed to dance in rhythm with her thoughts. "I can't promise a life without hardship," Ethan said quietly. "This land, this work, it takes everything a person has. But I can promise I won't walk away. Not from you. Not from Daniel. Not from any of them." Clara's breath caught, and for a moment tears brimmed in her eyes. She blinked them back quickly, though a single one escaped down her cheek. "You don't know what that means to us," she whispered. "I do," Ethan replied, his voice steady. "Because I know what it means to me." The words hung in the air, heavier than any vow, lighter than any burden he had ever carried. The days that followed were marked by change, not in grand gestures, but in small, steady acts that spoke louder than words. Ethan built a sturdier fence around the garden so Clara could plant without fear of livestock trampling her efforts. He taught Samuel how to shoe a horse and trusted him to handle tools that once only his own hands had known. He carried little Daniel on his shoulders, the boy's laughter echoing through the open fields. Each act stitched together the fragile seams of a family that had been torn apart by loss and circumstance. And with each stitch, Ethan felt the weight of his past loosen, replaced by something he had thought forever beyond his reach: hope. But with hope came fear. One stormy night, as thunder rattled the windows and rain lashed against the roof, Ethan woke in a panic. For a moment, he was back in that fever-ridden night years ago, Anna's hand burning in his infant's cries dwindling into silence. His chest tightened, breath shallow, until Clara stirred beside him and laid a calming hand over his. "You're not alone anymore," she whispered through the dark. Her words anchored him. For the first time in years, he let himself lean into someone else's strength, allowing her presence to quiet the storm within. By the time the rain ceased and the plains glistened anew with life, Ethan had made his choice. On a quiet Sunday morning, he stood before Clara and the children as they gathered near the porch. His voice, though rough, carried a solemn certainty. "I've been given a second chance I never expected. Family isn't always what we plan, but it's what we fight for. If you'll have me, I'd be honored to call you all mine." Clara's breath hitched, her hand flying to her mouth as tears finally spilled free. The children, wide-eyed, uncertain, looked to her, then back to Ethan. Samuel's voice, steady but tinged with emotion, broke the silence. "We'd be proud to call you ours, too." Ethan felt his chest swell with something fierce and uncontainable. It was not the absence of pain. He knew the scars of loss would never fully fade. But standing there, with Clara's hand sliding into his and the children gathering close, he realized love was not meant to erase pain. It was meant to rise above it. The sun rose higher, bathing them in light, and for the first time in decades, Ethan Walker felt whole.